In CMSF 08, we've got the biggest CMSF ever. We've got 1,200 participants, and we thank you all for your interest, continuing interest, and for coming. We'd like to thank our industry partners. There'll be a number of slides that will show who they are. We thank them because without them, this could not be possible. We'd also like to thank our exhibitors. This is the largest exhibition ever. We urge you to visit the booths and not just find out about what sort of products and what's available from all those people exhibiting, but to make sure you enter the 3-day holiday prize at Sheraton Mirage, Port Douglas, and also that you nominate for the People's Choice Award. There's lots of fun and entertainment to be had on the booths. This is a great year to be having a conference like this. Over the next 2 or so days, we'll be exploring a whole range of issues, including how Australia is changing, what members really think about superannuation, what's in store for superannuation under a Rudd government, and what a nice change to not have to face an innumerable series of almost annual inquiries into superannuation in the federal parliament that seem to do little more than be a basis for an attack upon industry funds and amateur trustees. We'll find out what the industry expects also from the government and have a say in that. We'll talk about global market turmoil and the impact of the subprime mortgage markets, infrastructure, issues around water, energy and affordable housing, social capital and governance issues, and we'll be putting the ratings agencies under the spotlight. That reminds me, I have 2 announcements, perhaps 3. Scanning is compulsory. This is an important requirement for those people who pay money to send you these conferences, so they know that you've actually turned up and stayed for sessions. AIST members will get automatic certification, and anyone else who would like a certificate saying how long you were here, remember that's a 2-edged sword, can request one at the registration desk. Plenaries 7 and 8 have been swapped. Plenary 7 tomorrow afternoon was Senator Nick Sherry, and Plenary 8 was the ratings agencies under the spotlight. They're now swapped, so please note that, just keep that in mind. I look forward to the ratings agencies because they rate us often with unreasonable expectations and unreasonable short time frames, and I think we should shut them down 7 minutes into their contributions and rate them on their contribution before they've actually got to what they really wanted to talk about. CMSF 08 is becoming carbon neutral. 50% of the carbon released into the atmosphere for us to attend this conference will be there in 100 years' time. That's a sobering thought. One of the frightening aspects of the projections of science is that they are invariably conservative. Temperatures are rising faster than people expected. There are more extreme weather events than the scientists have predicted. US banks like Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley have all announced extreme environmental standards which will make it difficult for companies to raise money to construct coal-fired generators. Glaciers are melting at rates unanticipated. In today's Sydney Morning Herald, there was advice that a UN report just released of 30 glaciers showed that between 2005 and 2006, the rate of thinning had more than doubled. Temperatures across the globe are 0.8% above pre-industrial levels. Another 0.5 to 1% is already locked in from the carbon that exists in the atmosphere or will go there within the next 100 years. It's 130,000 years ago that it was the last time that the Earth was plus 2% above the pre-industrial level mentioned earlier. That means, amongst other things, that sea levels are projected to be 4 to 6 metres higher, which means those of you who've chosen to sat in the first 10 rows here had better move sometime in the next 100 years. They are sobering statistics. But what's CMSF 08 doing about it? A number of important things. CMSF has taken the view that it's important for us to reduce our carbon footprint. There are a number of slides that will show the steps that are being taken now that climate change is an undeniable scientific fact. We've initiated a project to identify the size of our carbon footprint. Each of us contributes 0.5 of a tonne in coming to CMSF, 0.5 of a tonne of carbon emissions. Now, I don't know how much that is as a gas, but as a weight, 0.5 of a tonne is a great deal of weight, and we've all contributed it, and half of it will be there in 100 years' time. 105,000 kilometres of travel involved in vehicle travel for us to get to and from and around at CMSF. 50,000 kilometres of taxis, 13,000 kilometres of trains and 40,000 kilometres of private vehicle travel. The process will be to identify the areas where the footprint can be reduced and purchase carbon offsets to offset those emissions that can't be reduced. And we thank Industry Funds Management for the purchasing of carbon offsets, which will be calculated subsequently to the conference to make sure that we are as close as we can to carbon neutrality. What all this really means is that we are looking for, in 2010, a CMSF conference which has no emissions at all, or if I can get away with saying on St Patrick's Day, no emissions at all at all. I declare the conference open.
Well, I'm delighted, of course, to see a change of government, but because I thought Australia became a mean and compassionless society. And when you look back over those 10 years, we were closer to 15% super than we are now. People were prepared 10 years ago, prior to the Howard government, of course, the Keating government. People were prepared to bite the bullet on important social policies.
Australians exporting to the world now, and a lot of what we're exporting is not manufactured goods, it's smart thinking and good ideas. And you look at the industry we operate in financial services, very much underpinned by this amazing retirement savings system. And I would say that we are a leader in the world, despite the fact we're a long way away, and that's because we've had this retirement savings system develop around us. It's a large system, it's now extremely well regulated, and as a result of that, it's become very competitive within Australia, and we've developed an industry, I think, that is at the forefront.
Look, Australians traditionally have not been saints, and nor have they been demons. I've always thought of Australians as just moderately decent people, and we can flip slightly one way or slightly the other depending on the quality of leadership which is provided. And I think something in the course of the last 12 to 18 months changed, and Australians have flipped back to, if you like, the more benign spirit that has typically animated the community.
Somehow the consumer just clicked last year and suddenly said, super's no longer a rip-off. It's actually really tax advantaged, and it's actually good for me and will actually help me in my retirement. And we just saw that. I reckon that's the biggest moment in the last 10 years for everything. The consumer suddenly said, super is good.
Unfortunately, over the past 10 years, Australia became an increasingly mean-spirited place, and with a widening gap between the haves and have-not.
We've got used to success. We've got used to, environment where real incomes are rising, employment strengthening, jobs. We feel much more comfortable about our role in the world.
As a country, Australia's become much wealthier over the last decade. I was only just reminded of that by some overseas visitors who'd kept on telling me how prosperous they thought Australia had become since their last visit.
The most significant change for Australia and indeed the world is really the acceptance of the internet.
A greater level of adequacy, a much simpler system, and a more cost-effective system.
The biggest change obviously has been, for my mind, the change of government, and I think that has brought with us a change in the attitude of the community.
Everybody has felt wealthy, and I think what's happened is that an increasing generation of Australians do not understand economic danger.
We've had such a period of affluence that we've never seen before. Well, I mean, we probably have seen it at some stage, but we've got generations of people that have never seen sort of unemployment.
It was far more prevalent during the Howard years. It was very much a selfish meism, that developed within Australia that certainly wasn't there when I first came out here.
I think the biggest change is there's become a realisation that people need to save and have funding for their retirement. I think 10 years ago it wasn't an issue.
Australia is more of a shareholder democracy than it ever has been before, and I think super has played a big part in people's awareness of the markets and a big part in that shareholder democracy taking hold.
We've matured as an industry and more confident about our own capabilities rather than being led by what's really happening in the US or the UK.
The world's effectively shrunk. The role of technology's changed. We now use technologies that we didn't a decade ago, and that has had implications for what happens in financial services.
A lot has happened, but have we come a long way? We have a great super system that we've come to love, but it needs a lot of work to get it to where it should have been a decade ago. Many of us are wealthier, but we have a lot more debt. And a lot of the people our Fidelity film crew talk to are concerned about the lack of certainty that they believe continues to surround super policy. Many people saw the change in government at a time when the world saw Australia as being in the hands of outstanding economic managers as a significant reflection of Australia's changing mood. Time will tell.
Well, it's time for Plenary 1. Hugh Mackay, and the session title is Advance Australia Where? How Australia is Changing. It seems we would undersell Hugh if we described him as a psychologist, social researcher and writer, but he has nevertheless made a lifelong study of the attitudes and behaviour of Australians. He's the author of 11 books, including 5 bestsellers in the field of social analysis and 4 novels. His latest book, Advance Australia Where, was published in 2007. It will, incidentally, also be available in the foyer at lunchtime. In recognition of his pioneering work in social research, Hugh has been awarded honorary doctorates by Charles Sturt, Macquarie and New South Wales universities. Hugh is a Fellow of the Australian Psychological Society and received the University of Sydney's 2004 Alumni Award for Community Service. He writes the weekly Moral Maze column for the Sun Herald and the West Australian, and also writes occasionally for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. He is a frequent broadcaster on ABC Radio. The plan is that Hugh will speak for about 45 minutes and then there'll be time for questions. Please welcome Hugh Mackay.
Thank you very much, Ian, and good morning, everyone. A couple of years ago, I was invited to a very formal dinner in Sydney, the sort of thing I normally try to avoid, but I was trapped into it. So I turned up, and I found myself at this dinner seated beside a very pleasant, articulate, thoughtful, intelligent woman, and I thought, well, this is going to be an interesting evening. In fact, she spent virtually the entire evening describing to me in quite intricate detail the recent renovation of her bathroom. Now, this is a woman I'd never met before. Never been to her home. I'm never likely to go to her home. But she assumed that I would want to know that previously it had been quite a dingy space with just a little window to the south, but with the introduction of a skylight, it was now bathed in sunshine, and the tiles they'd chosen to set off this renovation were a sensational success, except that they had shown up the rest of the house. So they were now involved in a kind of rolling renovation, and that very day had installed the bifold doors, which had opened up, on and on and on. You know the kind of thing. I'm sure you've been pinned to your seat by someone who assumed that because they were doing their renovations, you would be interested. Worse, you have perhaps pinned someone else to their seat because you thought they'd be interested in what you did to your kitchen or bathroom. Well, this was not the only time it's happened to me, but it did set me thinking about this national epidemic of home renovations that Australia has been engaged in for much of the past decade. And it caused me also to think about why this is. Of course, you can always give a rational explanation for why people do what they do. Yes, we all like to improve the quality of our homes and increase their value and make life more comfortable. But I think we always are behaving symbolically as well as rationally. And I think the symbolism of the home renovations epidemic is really very significant if we're trying to understand just how Australia has been changing over this past decade or so, and what the implications of that might be for the business that you're in. I see the renovation epidemic as the great Australian escape, the great strategy that we seized on for distracting ourselves from the big picture. This was a time in which you could see this in the behaviour of the television viewing audience. This was the time when news and current affairs on television took a nosedive. We turned away from those programs in droves. Normally, in Australia, about 4 or 5 of the top 10 television programs each week are news and current affairs programs. But during this period, from around about the turn of the century on, usually perhaps 1, occasionally 2 staggered into the top 10. It's all changed again now, by the way, but we'll come to that. But what were we watching instead of news and current affairs? Well, we were watching programs about home renovations, believe it or not. Here we were in our millions, week after week, year after year, sitting, watching on television how to tart up your backyard, how to paint the children's bedroom, how to get a cupboard built in, etc. An extraordinary little demonstration of a real mood shift that was taking place in Australia as we moved through the turn of the century. Now, what was that about? I think what it was about was a nation that had had too much. We'd had too much change, too many threats, too many challenges. We'd been through a period of social and economic, cultural, technological upheaval at home, and on a grand scale we were beginning to understand that the planet itself was at some kind of environmental, ecological risk, that there was the threat of international terrorism, that the economic outlook on a global scale was becoming increasingly uncertain. And our response to all of that was to say, let's switch off. Let's focus not on things that seem to be beyond our control, but let's focus on things we can control. Now, that proposition seems to me to explain a lot of what has gone on in Australia in the last 10 years. But let's wind back a bit first to see what it was that got us so steamed up. Why did we reach the point where it felt like overload? Why did we, during the 1990s, become the world's second highest per capita consumers of tranquilizers and antidepressants? Why did our consumption of antidepressants triple in that decade? We'd reached the point by the end of the 90s where some cynical social analysts, more cynical than I, were saying if by now you're not on antidepressants, that's because you haven't actually understood what's been happening to you. I think that was perhaps going a bit far. But what had been happening to us? Well, let me just give you a few quick demographic and social snapshots of the Australia that we've come from, which has brought us to the point that we're at now. Let's start with the institution of marriage. Here is one of the most dramatic examples of something which I've come to believe about Australia over the last quarter century, which is that we are no longer dealing with trends, we're dealing with fractures of trends. The way to understand what's going on is to think, rather than traditional graphs, think more of a kaleidoscope where patterns keep dissolving and reforming. So let's look at what the kaleidoscope has been doing to marriage. 30 years ago, almost all of us were married, 90% of us were married by the age of 30. Today, that's dropped to about half that figure, about 45, somewhere between 45 and 50% of us are married by the age of 30. Now, for that to have changed, really in the space of a quarter of a century, is not a trend. That's a trend that fell off a cliff. That's the fracture of a trend. About 30 years ago, almost all of us who got married stayed married, and only about 8 or 9% of Australian marriages ever ended in divorce. There's another trend that got fractured. Today, somewhere between 35 and 40% of contemporary marriages will end in divorce.